Fundada em 1996, a Marsh Hill Church foi pastoreada por Mark Driscoll e se tornou uma das forças mais influentes do evangelicalismo americano, encontrando seguidores fiéis internacionalmente, inclusive aqui no Brasil. Mark Driscoll foi um pregador notável, possuía mais de 1 milhão de downloads por mês no auge do seu ministério em seus sermões. Sua igreja se tornou um fenômeno cultural em Seattle e Driscoll virou certamente um dos pastores mais influentes do mundo. Aqui no Brasil, trechos dos seus sermões eram legendados e fizeram muito sucesso em vários canais do YouTube. Eu, pessoalmente, estive envolvido no processo de tradução e legenda de alguns trechos de sermões do Mark Driscoll no Brasil. E foi em 2014 que uma espiral de colapso trouxe desgraça sobre o ministério de Mark Driscoll. Ele sempre foi envolto em muitas polêmicas, mas diante de várias acusações de uma liderança abusiva, de fraude envolvendo seus livros, acusações de plágio, desvios financeiros e um tipo abusivo de liderança eclesiástica, acabaram levando ao fim de um ministério multimilionário e de uma rede de igrejas extremamente influente. Toda a história de ascensão e queda do ministério de Mark Driscoll foi contado em um podcast que se tornou um dos podcasts mais ouvidos do mundo, o Rise and Fall of Marsh Hill, a ascensão e queda de Marsh Hill. Eu não tenho acesso aos dados de quantos downloads esse podcast tem no Brasil, mas ele é um fenômeno entre a comunidade pastoral brasileira que foi profundamente influenciada pelo ministério do Mark Driscoll e que teve que assistir, às vezes um tanto de camarote, a queda de um dos heróis do novo calvinismo aqui no Brasil. Por isso que foi muito interessante poder conversar com Mike Cosper, que é o host do Rise and Fall of Marsh Hill, quando eu pude estar nos Estados Unidos na Acton University em Grand Rapids, Michigan. Eu pude fazer várias perguntas interessantes sobre o que é que nós aprendemos com a queda dos heróis, sobre os erros do ministério do Mark Driscoll e sobre como nós podemos aqui no Brasil aprender sobre liderança, sobre masculinidade tóxica, sobre complementarismo, sobre cultura de celebridade e sobre como não nos tornar os monstros que nós estamos tentando destruir. Convido você a me ouvir falando um inglês terrível e macarrônico, mas que graças a Deus o Mike Cosper teve paciência e conseguiu me entender em uma das entrevistas que eu acho que são uma das mais importantes que a gente já fez aqui no canal. Ainda que você não seja um dos que foi influenciado pelo ministério do Mark Driscoll, assiste o vídeo até o final. Certamente existirão lições muito importantes que você pode tirar sobre igreja, sobre vida cristã e sobre como amar a Deus em uma cultura de celebridade. Mike Cosper, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us in 2 Dedos de Teologia, our podcast of theology in Brazil. It's for me a great honor to be with you. The rise and fall of Marsh Hill was really challenging to me, because Mark Driscoll was one of my saints, you know. On Brazil, Mark Driscoll was a great phenomenon because Mark Driscoll was a great Calvinist preacher, and 5-10 years ago, we didn't have in Brazil a lot of Calvinist preachers. They exist, okay?
Sure.
But they are in the church preaching for the community, and YouTube was not a big deal at that time. So on YouTube, we has only American preachers being translated with Brazilian subtitles in Portuguese. I personally translated and made in subtitles to Mark Driscoll preaching cuts because of the language barrier. We are not with intimacy with his polemics. So, okay, Mark Driscoll has involved in a lot of polemics in all his ministry, but what we are watching was not that. We are watching his preaching, and okay, he has a lot of good preaching. Mm-hmm. For us, the fall of Mark Driscoll sounds like something who happens from a day to another. So he was a great preacher, a great pastor, maybe a good man, a good preacher, a good pastor, and another day he was fall in sin. You could see this coming because for us, we didn't see that.
Yeah, I would say, I think inside the stream of people who were following Driscoll closely, starting around 2010, 2011, there were some alarm bells going off. A lot of the values that really shaped the church early on that were about Seattle and a specific group of people and embodying the culture of those people, those started to kind of fade. And interestingly, his polemic stayed as strong as it ever did, but it almost seemed like he was rounding off the edges of the Calvinist theology, the atonement theology, sort of the strong substitutionary vision and stuff. It was all there, but there was a very clear sense that he was transitioning to try to go broader than he had gone before. So I think that was an alarm bell for a lot of people. And then there were these stories that would pop up online, people getting fired, sort of mysterious circumstances. But yeah, it really didn't take off until, mid 2013 was this just cascading series of events.
I'm afraid to say that Mark Driscoll would never fall in Brazil. Maybe he's falling in his heart, but in his public ministry, nah. Nothing would happen with him. The things that caused his fall, like authoritarian leadership, fraud in book selling, and something like that, wouldn't cause fall for him in Brazil.
Interesting.
People in Brazil only look to more serious things, like sexual sins, adultery, and something like that. In some cases, even adultery would only let pastor in the band for some time, and nothing more than that. In Brazil, voting in the wrong politician can cause you more problem than be an authoritarian leadership.
Wow.
What make the US look differently to these ethical failures involving authoritarianism and as a reason to the position?
What's interesting is I think it was less about sort of American culture with the church and more about the stream of evangelicalism that he had established himself in. So there are denominations, there are churches, there are traditions where the expectation is kind of like the pastor is the only elder, he has absolute authority, he can kind of do whatever he wants. And I would say even especially more so in certain branches of the charismatic tradition, certain branches of what's often referred to as like the prosperity gospel kind of world. So yeah, I mean, you see similar things to what you described in some of those pockets. What made Mark unique is he planted this church and said, we're about elders, we're about accountability, we're about all these things. And so when the authoritarian stuff started happening more aggressively, the fraud around the books, all that kind of stuff, the problem was it was running up against his own words and his own promises to his church. And so I think that was what created more of the tension than necessarily the issues themselves. But yeah, I would say I think it's a good thing that he fell. Don't get me wrong. I just think it's not surprising to imagine lots of churches in the broader culture in the United States where he wouldn't have.
This type of personal and aggressive leadership has becoming ever more famous in Brazil. How I said to you, we have a lot of little Mark Driscolls, doppelgangers trying to figure out how to become this even mailer with mainly ministries with a lot of angry in that. We have a lot of preachers who say you need to find out your aggressivity, your anger inside and use that for the kingdom and this kind of stuff. Pastors present themselves with this kind of aggressive preaching. What warning can you give to us in Brazil?
Yeah, I would start by saying, look at the qualifications of an elder in the scriptures. There's just nothing of the sort in terms of anger and violence and aggression and all of that. I mean, so many of the images, most of the images of the pastor in the New Testament, the care for the church, I would say most of the imagery of Jesus in his own ministry is about compassion, gentleness, teaching, character, embodying the values, embodying the fruit of the Spirit. What's remarkable to me about Driscoll is how often, in order to justify that kind of aggression, you have to go to a very narrow bandwidth of scriptures, right? Jesus in the temple, and then the imagery of Jesus in the book of Revelation. Now, let's not talk about the Lamb who was slain before the foundations of the world, because that's a soft image. Let's talk about Jesus with a sword coming out of his mouth and all of that. So it comes back to just your doctrine. We need to let the scriptures interpret the scriptures and recognize that, yeah, there's a spiritual war, there's a holy war and all of that. But the presence of the church and the witness of the church is faithful presence, love, gentleness. Again, fruit of the Spirit.
Essa resposta do Cosper sobre ministérios de masculinidade que tentam imitar o Mark Driscoll de alguma forma é uma resposta muito séria, porque parte do processo de queda do Mark Driscoll foi a acusação de um tipo de masculinidade completamente enraizada em uma cultura machista, não num padrão complementarista e bíblico de fato. Uma vez que o Mark Driscoll continua, mesmo depois da sua tão evidente queda, sendo exemplo para ministérios de masculinidade no Brasil, é algo que tem que nos deixar muito preocupados com os tipos de modelo que a gente tem tentado seguir. Daí, eu pergunto pro Cosper sobre ele ter tentado contato com o Mark Driscoll para que ele participasse do podcast, dando sua opinião, dando sua versão dos fatos. Infelizmente, o Mark Driscoll nunca aceitou. Eu perguntei para ele como ele acha que o podcast seria diferente se o Driscoll tivesse aceitado participar. How do you think the documentary would be different in such a scenario? They gave you an interview asking questions and something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really don't know. You know, his last really confrontational interview was 2013 before the church fell. I would love to know. I'd love to know what he thinks. I'd love to know his response to the series. My sense is, from the way he's responded subtly here and there, is that there's just not much responsibility that he wants to take. And I think that's part of why he hasn't done the series and why he hasn't done other interviews about the series.
In the opening of the podcast, you said, it's a quote, "It's also a history about the mystery of God working in broken places." Mm-hmm. How do you see the church as a means to this process of restoration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things that has encouraged me, as you know, through doing the series, is simply the fact that, you know, even many of the people who were deeply wounded in their experience of the church, there's kind of this sense that like they're Christ haunted, right? Like he just continues to pursue them. They haven't been able to get away from faith, even at times when they've wanted to reject it. And so I think that's a really encouraging thing. I would say as well, the thing that made the fall of Mars Hill so heartbreaking for the people in the church was that the community was so tight. It wasn't even necessarily the sort of idolization of Mark. And so for the church to fall apart and to be such a destructive thing, they lost so many of their friendships. I think there's a redemptive thing happening, honestly, even in the aftermath of the podcast, as some of these people are coming back together and realizing, oh, the friendship was real, like the spiritual friendship, the spiritual community was real, and we can restore some of that.
How can we protect ourselves from having our faith traumatized by leaders that become such a bad example, like Driscoll was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think one is, so I genuinely believe Christians need to have, you know, there's this Catholic idea of like the tragic sense of life.
Yeah.
Evangelicals don't do that well. Like we don't do suffering well. We don't do lament well, because overall, like, you know, there's this idea of like the over-realized eschatology, right? Like the Christian life is supposed to be this sort of victorious thing. And so what I see predatory leaders often do is they promise that. They promise, you know, super victory, you know, happy kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that's just it's number one, it's a false promise. People get cancer, people die in car accidents. I mean, there's just tragedy in life. And what the church should be doing is be this faithful place to be a shelter in the storm for those things. That doesn't fill pews as easily as I have a wonderful plan for your life and I know how to make you happy and your kids happy and your marriage happy.
Yeah.
But that's the message of the gospel. God is with us in our suffering, not here to alleviate it.
Yeah. In Brazil, people from churches don't receive well when the ministries are exposed. The person who exposes errors in the ministry, it's seen as an outsider, far from the respect of the circle of influent people. The rise and fall of Mars Hill was produced by Christianity Today, a huge platform. How do you see the acceptance of Americans to this kind of material, and how do they react when they see the rise and fall of Mars Hill?
Yeah, it's a super diverse mix of reaction. I think the vast majority heard it and kind of resonated with the concerns that there's something going wrong with leadership, both inside of evangelicalism and more broadly. We have a leadership crisis. There were definitely some people who I would say are sort of more on the far conservative right who felt like it was an attack on evangelical values or an attack on biblical complementarianism or various theological things, which it really wasn't. It was the degree to which we addressed some of those things were simply about trying to understand why Driscoll was accepted in certain circles. But then we also got really intense critiques from very, very progressive, kind of the left side of Christianity, who just thought we had gone too soft on Mark and too soft on patriarchy and all the rest. And so yeah, I mean, you got it from kind of every side. For me personally, the litmus test was whether or not the people who came on the show and told their stories felt like we did a fair job. And overwhelmingly, that was super encouraging. People felt like they were heard, and that's what mattered most to me.
Yeah. For us in Brazil, it's a really hard stuff when our saints felt.
because we just read their books in another countries. We just receive the best of these guys. So it's the filet mignon of everything they did in ministry.
Yeah.
So it's the best books are translated, the most viewed sermons are translated. So we love these guys more than you here because we didn't see anything wrong in that.
Yeah.
They are just the best of the best was translated to us. So when we are with internet, we are closer to the polemics, the accusations, the cover of abuse scandals in their churches. When this kind of material came to us in Brazil, it's afraid us and became a scandal. People shoot the messenger when we say that. With this SBC scandal, I did a video on Brazil reporting about what is happening in the United States. I quoted a lot of scandals cases who was really know here. You know about it.
Oh, yeah.
But when we talk about it on Brazil, sounds like it's false, can't be true. I was really blessed by this ministry. I can't believe that.
Yeah.
And people blame the victim, blame the messenger. I was in my house before came to United States thinking how Mike Cosper was blamed for the things he are publishing in his podcast.
Yeah, no, we definitely got it, and I definitely heard from a number of people who just felt like, there was just one on Twitter the other day, somebody coming at me and saying, the real problem with the church is, journalists who just want to bring down the church and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, man, I love the church. I'm a member of the church. I had a very hard experience at the church I helped plant, but I'm still a member at that church, and I'm still thankful for it and thankful for the community we have. I just want to see a better and more beautiful church. And I think what you said about, what you all experience in Brazil in terms of getting the best from these guys, that's such an important point. Because what it gets to is the way that like mass media enables people who don't have the character to actually love a flock of people, to package themselves in a really compelling way and reach a big audience. That was Mark did that. Mark kind of set the tone for that, right? Like he snuck in the back door, practically through a tunnel, preached, and then disappeared. Especially at the end of the life of the church. And so when the structure is designed where the pastor doesn't actually have to pastor and suffer with people, then you're setting the table for this kind of thing, because it's just so easy for somebody to stand in the pulpit and not actually embody the character.
Diante disso tudo, você pode estar perguntando, será que o Driscoll não tem apenas sofrido essa cultura do cancelamento que tenta cancelar os homens de Deus ou o que quer que seja? E existe uma boa diferença entre a cultura do cancelamento e uma cultura de accountability, de prestação de contas. É uma palavra muito conhecida no mundo americano. A cultura do cancelamento não é uma invenção brasileira, ela existe também nos Estados Unidos. Os brasileiros gostam, às vezes, de imitar certos padrões americanos, até mesmo naquilo que não presta. Infelizmente, muitas vezes, a cultura do cancelamento tenta destruir a vida de pessoas baseada em declarações que nem sempre são interpretadas da melhor forma e, às vezes, não são sequer verdade sobre aquilo que o indivíduo pensa. As pessoas se esforçam para chegar ao pior tipo de conclusão possível acerca do modo como as pessoas pensam e agem e falam, a fim de destruí-las, porque elas não se adaptam, talvez, a algum tipo de padrão comportamental ou político do momento. Essa foi a pergunta, então, que eu fiz pro Mike Cosper: como ter uma cultura de prestação de contas sem cair em uma cultura do cancelamento?
How can we have a culture of accountability? We need a culture of accountability. Avoid some kind of frenetic public court law.
Yeah. No, so I would just want to say up front, like, I totally believe cancel culture is a thing. Like, I don't dismiss that at all. What I would say differentiates sort of cancel culture from something like the Mars Hill phenomenon, and there's a bunch of other examples, James McDonald, Bill Hybels, others. With cancel culture, it's like you cross this threshold, and maybe what you said was intentional, maybe what you said was unintentional. There was a recent account of a guy named Ilya Shapiro said something that was very poorly worded, and it was received very badly. He apologized, he clarified, and all of that, but people still wanted his head. Classic example of this. And I think that's the difference, right? Like if somebody comes forward and says, hey, I made a mistake here. I'm really sorry. That's not what I intended to say, or I shouldn't have said it, or anything like that. Like they're embodying like repentance. That's great. What you see with so many of these, unfortunate fallen pastor stories is I did nothing wrong. These people are crazy. These people are weak. They're snowflakes. They can't handle how strong and powerful and masculine I am. So they're just weak, and that's just a very different thing. And that's where the accountability has to say, no, like if there's no spirit of repentance, no pursuit of reconciliation, then that's where accountability has to say, hey, we have to draw a line here. Until you're willing to like own some things, we just have to draw a line.
Yeah. I listened to your podcast. It was great. There's a question about woman on podcast. Maybe the title is What We Did to Woman, right? Mark Driscoll was, but I think he still is, complementarian.
Complementarian, yeah.
Just like me, I'm one of them. The way I see some complementarianism ministries mistreat women in producing chauvinist content led me to rethink the way, not my theology, but maybe the way I was applying my theology to women in ministry, in churches, in houses. My fundamentals didn't change, but I was thinking maybe I could be a chauvinist just using a conservative theology was an excuse to do that.
Yeah.
So to me, the act of Listen, Rise and Fall of Marshall Hill was an act of self-investigation. I loved the ministry of Marshall Hill. I loved the preaching of Mark Driscoll. So I need to be careful because I used this man as a model. Of course, it's a so distant model. I don't know him and all this kind of scandals. But you when this kind of accusation came rise, you need to figure out what happened with you, not with them, but with you.
Right.
But how do you think that complementarianists can defend themselves against a chauvinist leadership?
Yeah, I think so. One of the challenges I see for the complementarian sort of movement or whatever inside of evangelicals is that they have to be very careful about limiting themselves to first principles. What I see oftentimes is they say, okay, here are first principles, here are second principles, but if you don't abide by the second principles, then they're a slippery slope to getting rid of first principles. Yeah. Well, then that makes them a first principle, right? And so I think you have to be very careful about that. The other thing I think about all the time is part of what is unfortunate about the kind of complementarianism you saw at Mars Hill, but you saw really broadly, 15, 20 years ago, was that it held out as the ideal something that required like the economic model and the culture of 1950s, 1960s America. Middle class, dad goes to work, provides, pays all the bills and everything, comes home, 2.5 kids, wife has a chicken in the oven when he gets in the door and all that kind of stuff. That requires the economics to work, which all over the world, like in probably most of the world, it doesn't work that way. You need a household that's able to sort of provide everything that you need. And so I think that's one of those things that says, hey, if you can do that, if there are ideals there, if that's your sense of calling, that's great. But to sort of enshrine that within that sort of theological framework just goes way beyond what the scriptures would call. I very much believe, and I know of complementarian churches who I think hold those things really, really well. And it's why we didn't try to go all the way and say, hey, here are the poisons of complementarianism. But just simply to show, if you're not careful with these things, it becomes really poisonous. You got a pastor saying, wives, make sure you have nachos ready when the husband gets through the door. And that's beyond the remit of a pastor.
On Brazil, on Twitter, we have a lot of egalitarian people using your podcast as an argument against not the bad acts of complementarianists, but against the complementarianist theology. That's not the way we do theology. Well,
yeah. I mean, it's tricky. I think it's one of those things where in the process of critiquing something, people are always going to sort of push it in the other direction. And look, I have no beef with egalitarians either. It's, I think there's room in the church for various kinds of expressions. I think evangelicalism should be a big tent. I think we need each other, especially as the culture gets more aggressive and the pressures get harder on the church. But yeah, I mean, the intent was certainly not to say all complementarian expressions are bad. In fact, one thing worth mentioning is the very best critique of Mark's theology of manhood and womanhood was in the journal for the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. It was from a complementarian, and it was a brutal takedown of his book on marriage. And everything he said, I think, was spot on. And, he's as complementarian as it gets,
The podcast has an episode with Chad Gardner.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how the musical culture of Marsh Hill helped to define the church culture.
Mm-hmm.
Some churches think that a strong worship service can be a way to church growing.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on the dangers and challenges of seeing music more as a growth tactic instead of a way of worshiping?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I try to boil this down to a really simple question. Is your congregation singing? If they're singing, great. If it's rock and roll music and they're singing the gospel and they're singing songs that reflect the themes of the Psalms and the themes of the new, if it's a good text and they're actually singing it, great. If they're not singing, something's wrong. And I think what you see in a lot of church cultures is the platform is a place to perform and the audience is passive. And if that's the case, that's not the church being the church. Like Colossians 3:16 is we sing to one another. The word of God is dwelling richly among us as we sing. And so this idea of sort of performative presentation stuff, these worship texts that are very thin, I think that's something Mars Hill did well. Their texts are rich for their songs. So anyway, yeah, that's a very simple hermeneutic. Is the church singing? Okay, they're not singing. That's a problem. What are we doing? Is it too loud? Is the music bad? Like whatever it is. That's a very simple one to me.
A próxima pergunta ficou um pouco desatualizada, então deixa eu dar algum contexto. Quando eu tava entrevistando o Cosper, tinha acabado de sair um episódio extra do Rise and Fall of Marsh Hill, falando sobre o caso daquele documentário que a gente fez um vídeo comentando aqui no canal, Hillsong, a Mega Church Exposed, onde a gente encontra muitos pontos de convergência entre a história do Mark Driscoll na Marsh Hill e da Hillsong como apresentado no documentário. Acontece que agora já saíram mais 2 episódios extras do Rise and Fall of Marsh Hill. Um desses episódios, uma excelente conversa com Timothy Kelly acerca de todos os acontecimentos que envolvem o ministério do Mark Driscoll. E eu pude perguntar uma coisa muito séria, principalmente depois dos escândalos envolvendo a SBC lá nos Estados Unidos, a Southern Baptist Convention, que a gente citou no nosso vídeo sobre encobrimento de abusos sexuais nos Estados Unidos. Parece que nós, como cristãos, tendemos a passar pano para aqueles que nós gostamos e que temos alguma simpatia ministerial ou teológica, e nós pegamos pesado com aqueles que são do outro lado, que têm outras perspectivas ou o que é que seja. A pergunta que eu fiz foi como evitar esse comportamento de um duplo padrão para que possamos medir as coisas como elas realmente são.
Is Christian overlooking bad behavior practiced by those who are cherished by them and overburdening the ones who are not? How can we avoid these double standards?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 answers to that. Yeah. One is on the pastor side. I think pastors need to be honest with themselves about what we're getting into it for, right? If you're not about the ministry of pastoring via showing up at hospitals, doing funerals, being there in the hard times, that just reveals a ton. Yeah. And I think pastors need to be more honest about that. I think on the church side as well, people have to sort of investigate their own hearts too. Am I a passive participant or am I a member of a community? Is this a rich experience where I can be vulnerable and there are, there's sort of life to be shared? That's a different question. I also think like one of the very simple questions too is when you look at your church and you imagine the lead pastor, I don't mean to be crass, but you imagine the lead pastor getting run over by a bus, right? And if in your imagination the church falls apart on the other side of that, something's going wrong, right? Because how can the church endure the persecution of the first 3 centuries of its life, but it can't endure this guy getting hit by a car? That's a problem. So
I have my last question.
Yeah, okay, man, bring it.
And that question is important to me as a Christian producer. Like I don't know how to say that in English.
No, you're fine.
Without sound, maybe pride of it.
Sure.
In Portuguese, I can't sound humble. In English, I can't. Yeah. Maybe that's the truth of my heart. But I have this huge audience on YouTube on Brazil. I have this huge YouTube channel there, and I produce a lot of content, talk for 2 million people a month. Wow. And I every day trying to evaluate my work and try to figure out what happened in my heart. And I'm also doing some kind of content who can be more polemics. You know, you did the Rise and Fall. It's a huge polemics in an international level. So, in front of you, that's a question that I need to ask. The explanation made by you is that Driscoll sought notoriety, but there is the risk of the one who point the failures to fall in the same way. What have you learned in all these years producing this kind of content? How can we shield ourselves from becoming the monster we are fighting against?
I think two things, again. One is we need friends who are unimpressed by us, you know, and who know us. And it's critical. And I think it's critical on two sides, because on the one side, when you feel kind of that pressure of exposure, it's like, man, I need some people who are safe for me to go, I feel overwhelmed, I feel vulnerable. But we also need the people who are going to show up and say, man, you've kind of turned into a jerk, right? Like there's a problem here. But the second answer, and I think it's the more critical one, I mentioned, I think before we were recording, that I spoke with Tim Keller a few weeks ago. And I asked him this exact question. I said, you've got this big platform, you know, what has sustained you in ministry all these years? And he said the most fascinating thing. He said, you know, people always say, I need accountability. You know, I need my wife. I need these different people to know me, etc. He goes, at the end of the day, you can lie to anybody if you want. I can lie to my wife. I can lie to my friends, you know. He said, what I can't do is live a life pursuing deep intimacy with God and a deep life of prayer, and have it hanging over my head that I'm a hypocrite, because I want to be so invested in that life of prayer and that life of the experience with God that number one, I would be terrified of losing that. And number two, the other temptations lose their attractiveness, you know? And it's funny because, you know, you see the way the church has adopted all this like growth strategy and technology. We have all these tools in front of us. And it's like, what really matters? Like, pray, love the Lord, be humbled by it, be, you know, totally romanced by God, where your heart, you want nothing more. It's like, man, that's really basic and way harder, way more, because the other stuff, I mean, that's the work of the devil, right? It's way more enticing and way easier to say, I want to build an audience. I want to get the affirmation of the crowd. So yeah, that's what I've learned through this.
Thank you to contribute with us on Brazil. You will talk in Portuguese through the subtitles.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. No, I appreciate being here. Thank you.
O que é que você achou da entrevista? Comenta aí embaixo, deixe suas conclusões, seus comentários. Mas espero que ele tenha sido suficiente para trazer um bom conteúdo teológico para vocês e fazer uma entrevista tão importante com alguém que tem produzido conteúdo e tem sido relevante internacionalmente. Esse é o 2 Dedos de Teologia. A gente tem vídeo toda terça e quinta-feira, 10 horas da manhã aqui no YouTube. Um abraço e até a próxima.